Well, welcome back to another session of our World War II lecture series. Tonight we have a very good series of things that are being brought to you by the USS Silverside staff. Now, you know that each one of our presentations, we have an underwriter or a sponsor. And we do have a couple left, surprisingly. So if somebody would like to honor a person who is departed, or maybe you would like to have your family be a part of this or your company, please contact Frank Marzak. Remember, this is a privately supported museum. We do not get taxpayer donations. So to keep the lights on, the heat going, we need your support. Sound like public TV or something, PBS. I'm sorry. Okay, well, tonight we have two wonderful presentations. First, we are going to be joined by John McGarry, who is the executive director of the Lakeshore Museum, who will be talking about D-Day and the invasion of France. And he'll be talking specifically about one of Muskegon's heroes, Jumping Joe Byerly, who is a hero of two nations. And we're going to be hearing about that. And we are honored tonight to have the siblings of Joe, I'm sorry, not siblings, the children of Joe, present. And that's Ambassador John Byerly. Would you stand, please? Joe Byerly II and Julie Sugars Byerly. And you'll hear more about them a little later. They're going to be having a panel discussion, recollections of their father, which many of you know. Surprising how many people came up and were recounting stories. And, you know, when you grow up in Muskegon, everybody knows Muskegonites, right? It doesn't matter where you go in the world. So that'll be part of our function today. But prior to that, we do need a little analysis, some information to get us to the point of D-Day. We have been talking over the last few sessions about some of the events leading up to the American participation, full-fledged participation in the invasion of France. And one of the things that we cannot keep or take off our plate is this so-called alliance of allies. And I want to kind of bring this to your attention. This is not really an alliance. It's kind of like you're my friend because you're my friend because you hate that other person. So you're, the old story, you're my enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And I want you to keep that in your mind as we talk tonight about this alliance and what is behind this alliance, because clearly this is not always being orchestrated by the United States or Britain. There's Joe Stalin, who will be out there, who is really pushing heavily for this invasion to take off some of the stress that he's experiencing on the Eastern Front. And as you remember, Dr. Stahill's lecture earlier in the semester where he talked about how much fighting the Russians were involved with the Germans and how much Germany needed to knock out Russia very quickly. And when they failed to do so, and the tide began to turn, it is Soviet lives that are being lost in big proportions. Lots of people dying. And it's an incredible price that the Soviet Union will pay during World War II. And Stalin is concerned that he's not seeing a comparable effort being done by the British and the United States. And in a series of meetings we're going to be discussing here tonight, we're going to be talking about this alliance and how dysfunctional it may have been. Remember that the Soviet Union, up until World War II, is persona non grata. We don't want anything to do with them because they are what? Communist. Don't rub even elbows with them if you can, because it might be what? Contagious. We might catch something, right? So no U.S. president has met with a leader of the Soviet Union from the time of Lenin to Stalin. Well, the Soviet Union after the the Civil War, where the white Russians were fighting the red Russians, was quelled in 1921, there was no meetings. Well, even before that, the United States, France, and other countries, in a vain attempt to try to stop the communist takeover of Russia, remember we sent some forces called the Polar Bears to a place called Archangel. How did that work out? Not good. Didn't work out very well at all. And that's something that will be always in the mind of the Soviet Union, that the United States is no friend of who? Communism. So they're going to always be wary of the United States. No president has made any efforts to meet with the Soviet leaders. And this is going to be a problem going forward. Also remember that our relationships with England, even though we're friends, we are competitive friends. Who is the economic power prior to World War II? It's England. Everything was gauged in terms of economic transactions on the English pound, because England was the largest empire. The old saying, the sun never sets over the English empire. Well, they're the ones we're competing with. So we're going to be looking at this from not only just, well, how do we help them, but maybe our help is going to be a little bit guarded. And I want to kind of plant that seed in your mind. So remember, when the war breaks out, we're on the sidelines. We're not involved in 1939, 1940. Our involvement comes with Pearl Harbor at the end of December 7, 1941. Well, the war is already going into its third year. England in the West, Western Europe, is an island nation under attack by the Germans, gasping for breath. And who do they look to for help? Well, the United States. The only country of large proportions that's not a combatant right now. They're the ones. And this Lend-Lease program, which we'll talk about in 1 second, involves the transfer of munitions, trucks, airplanes, material of war. But the problem is the United States can't sell it to you because we have laws on the books that prohibited the sale to any country, belligerent country, friend or foe. So Roosevelt comes up with this grand idea. He calls it Lend-Lease. I'm not selling it to you. I'm letting you use it. Rent it, so to speak. Well, Robert Taft, Senator Taft, who was a Republican, not always in favor of many of the New Deal programs, he says it's like renting chewing gum. You never expect to get it what? Back. Nor do you want it back, right? So keep that in mind. But here's what Roosevelt's strategy implies. He says, and he's talking about a fire. If your neighbor had a fire, his house was burning, and he didn't have a hose to put out the fire, he would run to your house, and you'd ask for a hose. And he says, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me for it. You don't have to pay me for it. I just want my garden hose back after the fire is over. Let's not talk about economics. Let's get your fire out. Well, we'll settle up later. Well, that was kind of somewhat of the naivety that was going to go into this at the beginning, but what we're going to see is it's not so naive. There's an economic factor that is going to come into play here. We're going to let you have this material if you bring us what? For a cash payment? Gold. And they're going to take gold from Britain, later Soviet Union, and other countries in the early parts of the war to pay for these munitions. Well, are these countries able to really come up with large sums of gold when they're in a fight for their life? Not necessarily. So this is, in a way, kind of breaking their economies. And who are we going to break? Not the Soviet Union, but who? Britain. going to weaken Britain so significantly that after the post-war era, Britain will come out of this a much weaker country. Keep our eye on that as well. Well, in order to get this dialogue going between these military leaders, it was essential that they start meeting. Because remember, Roosevelt has been somewhat hampered. He suffers from polio. He doesn't travel well. And let's be honest, most of what we've been doing in the 1930s has been aimed at domestic issues. He's been dealing with the New Deal. The ball hasn't been necessarily, or the looking out has not been necessarily at Europe, but what foreign policy we've been looking at has been South America, the Caribbean, countries that are in our immediate grasp, so to speak. Not looking at Europe, so to speak, going forward. The first meeting where they're trying to convene the leaders of what we will call the Big Three will come at Casablanca, Morocco in 1941, January. Well, if you look at that picture, you see two free French leaders. De Gaulle is one of them. He's seated between Roosevelt and Churchill. And we will see that who's missing from the picture? Stalin. Well, Stalin has two problems, right? He's fighting for his life. It's his 1943. The outcome of Operation Barbarossa is far from certain. Remember, the Germans are still pushing on Stalingrad. And number two, Joe does not want to leave the Soviet Union because he fears that if he leaves, what's going to happen? You might get deposed. So he says, I'm not coming. Can't go. Well, remember, we have an American president who is disabled, challenged, who has to make this trip. And it isn't like he just takes off from Washington and he can go right across the Atlantic straight on. The route involves him going down on a Catalina boat plane, which was a amphibious plane. It was pretty nice, actually, for the time. But he had to go all the way down to South America, cross over to Africa, and work his way back. 19 hours of flying over 2 days for a man with polio. How tired do you think the American president must have been? Now, that's going to determine future meetings, because if you get tired going 19 hours, how tired will you be going further? And I want you to keep that as part of your mindset, because it's going to become very, very difficult for him going out. And remember that the office of president, as much as we love or hate our presidents, we know it is physically what? Taxing. Look at Mr. Obama, for example. President Obama went in with a full hair of black hair, and he's what? Gray now. And he's not even 50. So we can see that it plays a big role in it. Now, we know that Stalin did not come. Part of it was a fear of flying as well. Doesn't seem to take the airplanes very well. So they agree at this meeting in Casablanca, the members that were there, that they will demand an unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Why did they want that? Well, they didn't want any one of the allies to strike out on its own deal. If one country decides to make a separate peace, this is going to put a monkey wrench in the whole united effort. So unconditional. We have to beat the Germans and the Japanese, and we got to make them surrender. And also the Italians, too. Let's not forget them. And they also agree in theory about a cross-channel invasion. Yes, we will come into France. Don't know where it's going to be, but we're committed to this idea. No timetable. Now, going forward, as we begin to see, this is not going to be satisfactory. We know that the Russians will continue to sustain huge losses, but they're going to start turning the corner. They're going to start counterattacking, and they're going to start rolling the Germans back. But it's slow. It's costly. They're doing the majority of the fighting in Europe. In November of 43, a conference was convened. Much discussion as to where it should be. At first, they talked about Baghdad. They talked about Cairo. They talked about a number of different places to keep it somewhat central so President Roosevelt didn't have to fly. Each time, Joseph Stalin said that was not acceptable. It's too far away. I can't make it. I'm under such stress here. You've got to come closer. Well, the compromise was Tehran, Iran. 2 reasons. Iran borders what country? Soviet Union. And it is accessible by what? Rail. By train. So they get a commitment. They meet in the Soviet embassy to have these meetings. Now, we could only imagine. I'm sure every room was bugged, but they didn't think about that back then. You know, we come in with a sense of trust. And I think that Roosevelt clearly wanted to meet Stalin and have a trust in this guy. But he's going to find that Stalin is a little bit tough to deal with. He's going to be very adamant. And his adamant stance is that, guess what? We need the second front. You guys are delaying. I don't understand. You committed to this at Casablanca. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Why are you waiting? We need a decision. We need it today at this meeting. You've got to make a commitment, and we need a timetable, and you better decide what to do. Well, I don't think that both Britain and the United States were prepared right then and there to make that decision, but they were forced into it. They knew the second front was essential. It had to be done. But now they're moving on whose timetable? Stalin's. Stalin's dictating the pace here. And the decision had to be made within a week of that conference concluding. So that meant by the first week of December, they have to make a decision. When is the date? Well, the date is selected based on a variety of factors. And these factors include the following. Just take a look here. First of all, the beachhead has got to be within a 150-mile radius of England. Why? Because you got to have the bombers go out and come back. You can't have them landing on aircraft carriers. We don't have enough of them. We can't sustain an operation like that, so they got to leave from England, bomb, strafe, support, and come back quickly. Remember, bombers don't have, fighters at that time don't have the range, so you have to have support. Now, the other thing is there's a variety of locations of ports in France, but we know that the Germans have steadily been building up each of these beachheads in anticipation of an attack. And who's been helping them do this? 2 generals, Guderian and Rommel. 2 of the best German generals have been involved in fortifying these beaches. And they're trying to figure, it's kind of a game of cat and mouse. Where will they strike? How will they strike? How many are coming? Because the German victory has to be achieved day one. You've got to repulse the invasion to have any sense of victory. And the Allies realize that the force that they have to put together is going to be the largest invading force ever. And I'm sure John will talk a little bit about this, so I don't want to steal his thunder. But this will be part of it. And they have to do it at a time of the year when the sea tides are at appropriate heights, so we don't have things getting stuck on the beaches. And it has to be with the moon. The moon, of course, determines the tides. So the date is decided either late May, early June. Well, we know that the first date selected couldn't go. And the push-off date was June 6th, 1944. Now, there are two areas that were part of the focus, or at least the discussion at the time. One is the Pas de Calais, and the other one is the Normandy beaches. And Normandy was the one that won out. First of all, the Germans had already pre-anticipated that if they used the Pas de Calais, they had it very well fortified. And in British minds, they did not want another incident. Early in the war, they attempted an invasion at Dieppe using Canadian troops. And it was a total disaster. The Canadians didn't even do well. They barely got ashore and they were repulsed, and lots of losses, lots of prisoners. It was a debacle. So they're a little skittish. And also the beaches at the Pas de Calais are not as wide, which is going to be significant because you need to land lots of forces, got to get them on the beachhead and then get them moving. So Normandy beaches were selected. And the reason why they're selected, they're also closest to Cherbourg and Le Havre, which are two principal ports that will become essential as this campaign begins to unfold for resupply. And here we go. This is the area we're going to focus on right up in here. That's where we're going to be talking about tonight. Well, I want to introduce my co-host tonight. Many of you know this fine man. His name is Neil Mullally, Judge Neil Mullally, the Honorable Judge Neil Mullally, presiding judge of the probate court of Muskegon. And why I like Neil is because he's a historian. I think he's a frustrated historian in a judge's outfit, because he's written a number of articles in conjunction with his son in a number of magazines, including Archaeology and a number of history magazines, and he always amazes me. He knows things that I haven't even heard about, and that makes a great guy. Well, Neil, he's got a stellar resume. Graduated from Michigan State University, so the Spartans in the house, you can be happy. And if you notice, he went to law school with the Big Blue. So it can't be that bad. He must have a house divided there. Must have to cheer with one pom-pom in each hand when he sees a game. At this time, I want to bring up Neil Mullally, and he's going to introduce our next series of speakers. Come on up, Neil.
Well, thank you, George. Once again, you've led us into the pathway for a great program tonight, and I'm honored to be here. I'm a member of the board of this museum, and I want to thank you all for coming here and participating tonight, and we look forward to the program. It's going to be two sections. John McGarry I'm going to introduce shortly, and he will make his presentation. And then after John, we'll have the three Byerly children, actually the three Byerly adults, will come up here to the table, and we'll conduct a panel discussion with them, talking about the experiences of their father in his service in World War II. John McGarry is a native of Maryland. He began his professional career in 1978 as a National Park Ranger and historian. He then served as the Register of the History and Museums Division of the U.S. Marine Corps in Washington, D.C. From 1987 to 1990, he was the Executive Director of the Mel Fisher Heritage Society in Key West, Florida, and developed the research facility and museum there in Key West. And he has some fascinating stories. Do you all know who Mel Fisher was? Mel Fisher was the sort of wildcat diver. I shouldn't describe him that way maybe, but he found all those Spanish shipwrecks and all the gold and doubloons down off the Florida Keys in southern Florida. And John was the one who brought organization to this man and formed the museum down there. He lasted 3 years, but John did. But in 1990, it was our good fortune to attract John to Muskegon as the director of the Muskegon County Museum, now known as the Lakeshore Museum Center. His leadership has resulted in taking that museum to levels I think that none of us had anticipated. He has too many accomplishments to list here at the museum, but the highlights include the passage of 2 tax millages to help support the museum, restoration of the downtown museum sites such as the Hackley and Hume homes, and if that all isn't enough, he's embarked on the latest development of Michigan's Heritage Park at Hilt's Landing near Whitehall, which is scheduled to open in 2015. John is a preeminent historian, and his personal passion, I know from knowing him these years, is military history. Please welcome John with us tonight for his presentation. John.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly humbled to have been asked to take part in this series that I know has gone incredibly successfully. So it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here this evening. And I would also tell you that I'm really impressed at the size of the crowd, that there's this many people that would show up to listen to history rather than sit in a bar somewhere and drink green beer. So being an Irishman myself, I welcome you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to cover some about D-Day that we've already discussed a lot in the pre-lecture. So I'm going to skip some of that material from my talk. But I'm going to cover some material that I think is critical to understanding D-Day. And then I'm going to tell the story of Jumpin' Joe Byerly, which again makes me a little nervous when I found out the Byerly family was going to be here. It's kind of like being asked to give a talk about Abraham Lincoln, and then Doris Kearns Goodwin is going to do a question and answer period afterwards. But for me, it's a very personal story. I've gotten to know the family well over the past number of years. And I'm very proud to say that I got to know Joe Byerly well. And I suspect there's many of you here in the audience. How many of you, would you raise your hand if you personally knew Joe? Okay, there's a lot in the crowd. He was very much our hometown hero, but he was also our friend, our neighbor, a person he ate lunch with, the Tuesday lunch bunch. Some of you know of that. For me, my relationship with Joe Byerly began about 18 years ago. At that time, my wife was the manager of the Frauenthal Theater downtown, and the head of the volunteer organization, the Friends of the Frauenthal, was a very dynamic, very powerful woman by the name of Joanne Byerly. And she and my wife were good friends and through that work. And she said that I should meet her husband with my interest in military history. I met Joe on the front steps of the museum. Now, this was a recent picture that was taken. And I, too, agree that we definitely need some green spring. But it looked a lot more like this the evening that I met him. We met on the front steps of the porch of the museum during a party in the park. And we sat and talked, and I first heard his story, and we had numerous talks since then. Getting to know Joe and being kind of the town's official historian, I was honored when Joanne invited me to the funeral at Arlington for the internment. And following that, she made it clear that she felt that this was a Muskegon story, and she wanted Joe's artifacts to remain here in Muskegon, and made arrangements for them to be donated to what was then the Muskegon County Museum. It's now the Lakeshore Museum Center. This is a story that has resonated with the world. As you know, the exhibit has traveled all over the world. It opened in St. Petersburg, Russia 2 years ago. It traveled throughout Russia, and then it appeared in Camp Toccoa, the National D-Day Museum in New Orleans, and at the Strategic Air Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. It's a unique adventure of Joe Byerly's story in the defense of his nation, but it was only 3 years of his life. After the war, Joe came home, and he was our neighbor, and he was our friend, and he was involved in numerous community projects. He was very involved in the Red Cross and Veterans Affairs and so on. And so we got to know him and his family as in that regards. Before I get into Joe's story, I want to talk a little bit more about D-Day. I think the easiest way to cover the vast majority of this information is to show you a video that I developed with the help of Dr. Stephen Demos, who's here on the Silversides board. This video was developed for the exhibit that we did at the museum.
The September 1939 invasion of Poland by German forces would mark the beginning of the Second World War. Within a year, the Nazis were in control of most of the European continent, and with Italy's declaration of war in 1940, the fighting spread to North Africa. 1 year later, the Nazis invaded Russia and laid siege to the cities of Leningrad and Stalingrad. The Eastern Front, as the Russian campaign was known, would become the largest military struggle in history. Historians estimate that between 27 and 30 million Russians would perish in that conflict. Hitler's threat of world domination became very real. By the end of 1941, the German army was the most powerful force mankind had ever encountered. The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the fight at a time when its military forces were dramatically under strength. To protect his European conquests, Hitler set out to build an impregnable wall along the coast. Using forced labor and millions of tons of concrete, the Atlantic Wall consisted of a complex system of fortifications and defenses. To carry the war to the Germans, it would be necessary to breach this wall. The United States began a long-term buildup of military forces and the material needed to support them. Industrial cities like Muskegon saw its young men rush off to the recruiting offices, while its factories geared up to produce tanks, planes, landing craft, and naval ships were developed to carry it all to England. By 1944, in association with our allies, all of the necessary pieces were in place to attack the German stranglehold on Europe. The plan was named OperationOverlord, and the day chosen was called D-Day. The plan was to attack the coastline head-on in what would become the largest amphibious invasion in history. With memories of the disastrous losses and failure of the Gallipoli invasion of the First World War, the entire operation was considered to be extremely dangerous. Elaborate schemes were developed to increase the chance for success. The invasion plans were one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and several deceptions were developed to confuse the German intelligence of where the attack would land. Another tool developed to ensure the success of the Allied landing was the creation of airborne forces. Just before entry into the war, American military planners had envisioned delivering infantry troops to the battlefield by parachute. This led to the creation of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Their job was to land behind the coastline in the hours just before the D-Day landings to seize critical bridges and roads that would be needed to break out of the beachheads. The airborne landings would hopefully also create havoc and confusion behind the German lines, disrupting communications and keep reinforcements from rushing to the defense of the coastline. In the late hours of June 5th, the paratroopers began boarding planes to begin the invasion. Heavily loaded with all the equipment and supplies they would need until they were joined by the infantry from the beaches, they climbed aboard C-47 aircraft. While durable as an aircraft, the C-47 had a lightweight frame and wings that were easily damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Long before the sun rose on D-Day, C-47s carrying the paratroopers crossed the English Channel. Flying in tight formations, they encountered heavy flak from anti-aircraft fire, with many of them becoming damaged or shot down. In the darkness, with little navigational direction, and flying at low altitudes, many of the pilots were unable to find their objectives and were forced to drop their paratroopers over a wide region, many of them in the wrong place. In the confusion of the drops, many of the paratroopers became separated and found themselves all alone once they had landed on the ground in enemy-occupied France. Up all day and evening of June 5th, having flown for 90 minutes from England, Joe Byerly's plane began to run the gauntlet of flight. Given the command to stand up, hook up, he stepped to the door, and when the red light turned to green, jumped out into the darkness. Landing on the roof of a church in the small village of Saint-Cont-du-Mont, he rolled to the ground. Like hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers that terrible morning, Joe Byerly had arrived in the killing fields of Normandy.
I think it's critically important to understand, because all of us remember America as the victor at the end of World War II, but we need to go back to 1941 as America's coming into the war. And it cannot be overstated that the German army at that time was the strongest, best trained, best equipped military force that had ever been on the face of the earth. They had the wonderful equipment. They were combat veterans. They were well trained. They had more divisions than anybody all put together. And they had literally conquered the face of Europe and were working on conquering Russia. Now, the one handicap they did have, and that's why I chose this photograph, a lot of people are unaware of the fact, because we hear so much about the term blitzkrieg, which was a brilliant military strategy, but about 60% of the Nazi forces were horse-drawn, and this would become a major problem for them later on in the war. But they were such a powerful force that I think that gets overlooked. So Hitler's threat of world domination became very, very real. Now, in 1941, America is brought into the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor. We're now fighting a two-front war, and we actually start out in the Pacific, and I'm sure you've discussed that in these courses, but as was discussed in the lecture just a few minutes ago, there was pressure from Russia to open a second front, and if the Allies were going to take the war to Germany, we had to break through that Atlantic Wall. Now, that Atlantic Wall was being built up as an impregnable fortress. All of the ports, all of the major entryways had been hardened. The Dieppe raid, as was discussed earlier, had been a failure. And we're also, I think it's very important to understand that Churchill, as our ally, was incredibly afraid about the invasion. He had been the Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War and had been involved in the Gallipoli campaign, where the British forces, primarily Irish Australians, had attacked on a beachhead at Gallipoli. They were never able to get off the beach, and the Turks literally massacred them. It was one of the largest disasters of the First World War. And Churchill was scared to death, which is one of the reasons that he kept pushing off the D-Day date amongst the Allies. The other thing that's critically important was that in 1941, the United States Army was so small, we had so little material in reserve, that it would take 3 years to get the troops recruited, to get them trained, to get them working as divisions and regiments and so on, and, just as importantly, to create the war material to support them. The tanks, the ships, the guns. And that's where Muskegon, as the arsenal of democracy, comes into play, because it was, by and large, the foundries that were right here in our town that were producing the gray iron materials that would be needed by the United States and all of the Allies. We'll talk in just a moment a little bit more about Russia, but it's estimated that we sent over 450,000 vehicles to Russia as a part of the Lend-Lease and then later on as an allies. Because As I say, it was all hardened. A lot of this was built with conscript labor or by people that had been sentenced to concentration camps. But the quality of these defenses were really incredibly well done, and I suspect that some of you have been over to see them. So there was a great deal of apprehension about the invasion. Not only were they building up forces and trying to keep secret the exact spot where they were going to hit, but all of the timetables, the details of the operation were all secret, one of the biggest secrets of the war. And there were a number of deceptions that were developed in order to make the Germans think the possibility of an attack at the Pas de Calais might happen. The Allies put together an entire fictitious army, and they chose George Patton to lead it. And there was, in middle and northern parts of England, entire fields, hundreds of acres of fake tanks. Hollywood produced all of this fake equipment so German planes flying over would see this and hopefully be fooled. If you want to read a wonderful book about all of the deceptions that took place in the D-Day activities, there's a wonderful book here entitled Bodyguard of Lies, and I highly recommend it. But finally, the day would arrive. On D-Day, actually June 5th, it was held off a day because of bad weather, and they thought they would get a break. I'm sure you all have seen the movie and know that story. But the decision was made to attack on the morning of June 6th, so the largest armada that the world had ever seen was to take off. The idea was to hit the beaches. Can everybody see if I point on here like this? Can you see out in the wings? All right. This is a map of the Vierville-Saumur cut that was carried by a friend of mine's uncle on the morning of D-Day when they hit at Vierville. This is part of the Omaha Beach, and these maps were done up for all the sectors that the Allies landed on. There's still many of them that have survived. In the northern part, or would be the northwestern part of the beaches, they had a long, slow slope to go up to the dunes, and when the English and the Canadians landed, they didn't run into a whole lot of opposition. I'm not saying it was a cakewalk, but it wasn't near as difficult as what the Americans ran into. Here at Vierville was the 116th Infantry of the 29th Division, and this was one of the toughest spots. If you watched Saving Private Ryan, this is the spot that was recreated in that film. And it's a very narrow beach, and these dunes here were hardened with concrete bunkers all the way to the top, hundreds of them. And there's a single road that goes off the beach. And that was the idea, to clear that road and to get up off the beach to avoid a Gallipoli type of disaster. If you only read one book about D-Day, I'd recommend The Bedford Boys. This was written by Alex Kershaw. This is the story of the 116th of the 29th Division, the Maryland Boys. Bedford, Virginia and Maryland comprised the 29th Division. And this was a National Guard division. The company from Bedford, Virginia, suffered over 80% casualties in the first 10 minutes. It's the highest casualty rate of any unit during World War II, and that's why the National D-Day Memorial is in Bedford, Virginia. It's also the reason why the 116th Infantry, that's the reason why the National Guard was never called up for Vietnam. They were afraid of having another small town like this be so heavily destroyed. What's fascinating about this book is it not only talks about the infantry, it not only talks about D-Day, but it also talks about the effect that it had on the home front. On June 14th, the teletype operator in Bedford, Virginia went in. At 8 o'clock, she turned on the machine, and it ran for 14 hours straight with notices, death notices to the families. That's poignant to me because my mother-in-law worked the teletype in Traverse City during World War II, and she tells stories of really bad days when they'd get those kinds of messages. My first opportunity to visit these beaches was in 1983 when I went over to France as part of the American celebration, the end of the bicentennial for the Treaty of Versailles. And I had an opportunity with a group of guys to go down to Normandy, and particularly the Vireville, to take a look at that area. If you have an opportunity, I would go to those beaches now. My first trip there, everything was grown over. And you really, standing down on the beach looking up, you couldn't see a great deal. For the 60th anniversary, they cut out all the brush and cut down all the trees that have grown up from the war. I was there in '85, and when you stand down on the beach and you look up at those dunes, you just see little concrete bunkers with holes in them everywhere. And you stand there and you think, how did those guys ever get off the beach? As I said in the video, one of the things that they were going to try to do to help people get off the beach was the delivery of airborne forces behind the beaches. The purpose here was to seize the critical bridges and roads that would be needed as the forces broke out, hit those little roads, and to get off the beach. It was also hoped that they would be able to create havoc and confusion amongst the Germans. And they even went so far as in sections where they weren't landing forces, they dropped these dummies. These little dummies would come down in nighttime. They would look like a regiment of parachutists. And when they would come down and hit the ground, they had a spike in their heel and a firecracker would pop off. So this created a great deal of confusion. When we talk about the airborne forces, we have to remember that these were young men. These are guys that are 19, 20, 21 years old. They've been training for, like Joe, he had been training for over 2 years. They're in the height of their physical prime. They're geeked, they're ready to go. Eisenhower, as late as June 4th, was thinking about calling off the airborne forces as part of D-Day. They were estimating that the airborne forces might suffer as much as 80% casualties. And so he kept waffling about whether to send the planes in or not. He finally made the decision to send them in because of that havoc and chaos that they could create behind the lines. And the last thing that happened before D-Day was that Eisenhower went and visited the airborne forces. This is why we have so many photographs, because he really felt in his heart that he was going and saying goodbye to all these young men. Now, the airborne forces had a special uniform for D-Day. This was a semi-canvas kind of cotton twill jacket, very durable, and it was full of pockets. Because remember, these guys are going to get dropped into enemy territory, and they're expecting that it could take 3 to 5, maybe 7 days before the forces can get off the beach and hook up with them. So they have to carry with them everything they're going to need for that period of time. All the food, all the ammunition, all the equipment, everything they need, they're carrying with them in backpacks and pockets. And many of the uniforms, the soldiers actually modified themselves by adding pockets on top of pockets. This is an original uniform that we had on display as part of the exhibit, and you can see why the Germans referred to them as the devils in baggy pants. Once again, young men, full of youth, vim, and vigor. On the night before the invasion, somebody got the idea to start shaving heads into Indian warlocks, into scalp locks. It was just youthful vigor, but it freaked the Germans out. In German prisons, not the concentration camps, but in German prisons, the most hardcore criminals had their heads shaved. And so when these guys started being seen throughout the countryside with these bizarre haircuts, the German military thought that America had emptied out its worst murderers, rapists, and so on to ravage the land side. They also got the idea to paint their faces with war paint. Again, 20-year-old guys. The night before the biggest battle or the biggest event of their lives to date. So they're doing all kinds of stuff like this. And then finally, when the planes took off, they were on the C-47s. And They're a very thin airplane. I personally have flown on the civilian version called a C-47, but they have a very thin airframe. I remember the night in Nebraska, Jack and Julie and I spent a lot of time on one that had been restored, and I specifically went to look at the airframe, and it looks like sheet metal. It looks like something you'd wrap your roof with. And so when they ran into the flak, remember this is the first time those pilots have been in combat as well, they started dodging the flak, they started flying all over. There's very little navigation once they get over the coast of France. And so they get nervous and start dumping their sticks, as they're called, the guys in the back are called. And the airborne forces of the 82nd and the 101st are literally dumped all over. Very, very few of them made it to their original objective. They suffered about 10% casualties, and many of those drowned in the flooded fields. Joe Byerly was born on August 25th of 1923 here in Muskegon, Michigan. By the time Joe started, the Great Depression had created tough economic times for all Americans. Joe's parents, William and Elizabeth Byerly, lost their home. Joe's older brothers left school and went to work for the Civilian Conservation Corps. His father's goal was to have at least one member of the family graduate from high school. This is St. Joe's Church, was right downtown and had a school attached. And that task of graduating from high school fell to Joe Byerly. Joe was very tall and lanky. He was an excellent athlete, and he lettered in numerous sports. As a matter of fact, in his senior year, the University of Notre Dame offered a scholarship for running a 5-minute mile. His strength and physical ability were important attributes in surviving the challenges to come. Joe graduated from high school in June of 1942. He turned down the scholarship from Notre Dame, and he enlisted in the United States Army. At that time of enlistment, if you joined the paratroops, if you volunteered for the paratroops, you earned another $50 a month. That was a very strong incentive. So he volunteered, and he was inducted into the Army on September the 17th, 1942. Remember that date, September 17th. He was sent to Camp Toccoa, Georgia, where he became a part of the elite 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, PIR, of the 101st Airborne Division. They became known as the Screaming Eagles. After 5 successful jumps, a paratrooper earned the right to wear his wings, paratroop wings. He was also authorized leave to visit his home, usually for the last time before being sent overseas. Joe told the story of, on being home on that furlough, a woman in downtown Muskegon saw his wings and thought he was a pilot. She asked him, "How many flights have you made?" To which he responded, 11 takeoffs, ma'am, but no landings. At Camp Toccoa, Joe endured grueling physical training, which included daily runs up the Currahee Mountain. Currahee became the battle cry of the division. And the 101st did not yell Geronimo when they jumped out of an airplane. They yelled Currahee. The idea of airborne troops was a new concept to the military. Every piece of equipment, tactic, training method, and system had to be invented and tested. Joe Byerly would become an expert paratrooper and contributed further by developing a new means of making a parachute landing. Like many other Americans, Joe made a long C-6 trip to England on a troop transport ship, the HMS Samaria. He arrived in England on September 17, 1943, 1 year after he had joined the Army. He had just turned 20 years old. He became a radio operator. He studied demolition and explosives, and his fondness for and skill at jumping out of airplanes earned him the nickname Jumpin' Joe. His skill at jumping was noticed by the officers of his unit, so he was sent on secret missions. He actually jumped into France a number of times before D-Day to deliver gold to the French underground. He would later be picked up and brought back. These secret jumps were done for the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which is the predecessor of the CIA. These are photographs of his training in England. Now, just before D-Day, again, they were fearful about what's going to happen to these airborne troops. The paratroopers were issued a small cloth American flag and told to sew it onto their uniform. This was the flag that Joe had in his scrapbook. And I believe, and I want to confirm with the family, I believe this is the only thing that he carried all the way through the war. Yeah. As I explained in the film, Joe landed on the roof of a church in Saint-Quentin-du-Mont. This is Joe visiting the church on the upper image years after the war on one of his trips back. Across the street is this small house, and I understand that when Joe went back for his first visit, he met a lady living in that house who had seen him land on the roof in the night of June 5 in the morning of the 6th. After landing, he ran out of the graveyard. He went out into the street, realized that he was all by himself, couldn't find anybody near him. He went out of town, he came back, there was a convoy coming down the street. He rolled some grenades under some of the trucks and blew them up, went back out of town, blew up a transformer, and it was just major confusion for him, for the Germans, for everybody. Much of this is taking place in the dark or in the early morning light. And after wandering around like this, as he told me the story on that front porch of the museum, he told me, "John," he said, "I'd like to think that I'm as brave as any other man." He said, "But I rolled over the hedge, and I landed right in the middle of a bunch of Germans with machine guns. And when you have 4 men with machine guns pointed at you, the only sensible thing to do is to put up your hands." Joe had been captured and became a prisoner of war. He was herded back towards Saint-Quentin-du-Mont, and while they were moving the prisoners back, remember there's still an invasion going on at this point, a naval shell landed, exploded, and he was wounded in the buttocks. Later, amidst the confusion of being moved, Joe Byerly was able to escape the Germans and make it into the woods. This would be his first attempt at escape. Joe was recaptured and brought back and beaten severely. He was taken to Starvation Hill. This is a photograph of Starvation Hill, 2 photographs of Starvation Hill that he took on one of his return visits. Now somehow, during this time, he lost his dog tags. And a few days later, a body was found with Joe's dog tags on them. And so he was initially reported as killed in action. His family was notified with a telegram. The top telegram is sending its regrets that he has been killed, and then it's talking about him possibly being a POW. Again, this is in the midst of an invasion, of a great deal of confusion going on, not just for Joe Byerly, but for hundreds of thousands of men and women and people across the country. He was interrogated when he was taken back to Starvation Hill, and he was interrogated repeatedly for hours. He's been wounded and weak from lack of food and water, and Joe describes that he went into an almost like dreamlike state, but he's certain that he never gave them any information beyond his name, rank, and serial number. Eventually, he and his fellow prisoners were loaded on trains and moved farther and farther back to a more permanent POW camp. Stalag 11A was the first one. Now remember, he's an airborne. He's infantry, he's army, he's a soldier, but in Germany, the paratroops were part of the Air Force. So he actually becomes a prisoner of the Air Force and is sent to a Luftstalag rather than a regular POW camp. Not that it really makes that much difference, but it is an important distinction. When Joe arrived at Stalag 12A and these are some photographs of visits he made back to that area. He was registered with the American Red Cross, and he was able to send a postcard home with word to his parents that he was alive. On September 17th, 1944, 2 years after he joined the Army, he was sent to Stalag 3C outside of Krustin, Poland. Here there were approximately 1,500 Americans, and this is another one of the postcards that he sent home. These items, by the way, are part of the archival collection. This was a family scrapbook that his mother and then Joanne had collected of all these documents that have been donated to our collection. Whoop, going too far. At this Stalag, there were approximately 1,500 Americans, which were called Kragis, and approximately 10,000 Russian POWs. The Germans, if nothing else, were meticulous record keepers. They kept records on everything, and much of those documents have been captured, and so we know what was going on. Now, the Red Cross sent food parcels for the comfort of American POWs. These food parcels contained condensed milk, canned meat, cigarettes, and chocolate. The cigarettes were so important that they actually became a form of currency in the POW world. One evening, Joe won 60 packs of cigarettes. He was a rich man. And he used some of them to bribe a guard to allow him to cut through the wire. Once again, Joe had escaped. He hid aboard a freight train with hopes that the train would take him into Warsaw, Poland, and he could get some help and continue on. But he jumped the wrong train. This train went to Berlin. And he ended up right in the heart of the Nazis. Using more cigarettes as a bribe, he was hidden in a basement by what he thought were anti-Nazi Germans. The next day, he was arrested by the Gestapo. Over the next 10 days, he was severely beaten and interrogated. Fortunately, German army officers showed up and demanded he be released from the Gestapo. This is now the fall of 1944. The war is starting to turn, and the German army is beginning to be concerned about the possibility of being charged with war crimes. So they're starting to take a little better care of the POWs. The army demanded his return, and he was sent back to Stalag 3C. In January of 1945, Joe made another attempt to escape. With a fellow prisoner faking an illness, Joe and 2 others managed to get past the gate. They jumped into some barrels in the back of a wagon, and they were able to get outside of the camp. Unfortunately, the wagon hit some kind of hole or something, and the barrels rode off, and the guards saw them. They opened up with machine pistols, and the 2 escapees with Joe were killed, but Joe was able to make it into the woods and make his way clear. Moving carefully through the Polish countryside, Joe was able to evade the Germans. Now, this was at a time when the Russians that was talked about in the introduction were moving into Poland and fighting back. After 3 days of traveling, he hid in the hayloft of a barn. That afternoon, he found the barn surrounded by a Russian tank unit. He decided that there was nothing else to do but to try to make friends. So he grabbed a pack of cigarettes and he walked out into the barnyard and he yelled out, "Amerikansky Tovarich," American friend. Joe convinced the unit commander, to his surprise a woman, that he was an escaped American soldier and that he wanted to fight with them. They were willing to send him back to Moscow to get him home, but he indicated that he wanted to fight on with them. So they gave him a Russian-made machine gun, such as this one, and allowed him to join the Union. As a result, Joe Byerly became one of the very few soldiers that we know that saw combat in a formal way with both the American and the Soviet armed forces during World War II. Moving west, the Russian tank unit began the push of the Nazis back towards Berlin. They captured the POW camp where Joe had been held. With his demolitions knowledge, Joe was asked to open the safe in the commandant's office. And it's a little faint here, but the card that's on the top here is, in my mind, one of the coolest artifacts I have come across in 40 years of curating military artifacts. When Joe went into the commandant's office, he blew the safe, and he had the forethought to go through the files, and he pulled his own Nazi POW ID card. And that's it. Continually moving, the Russian tank unit pushed the Nazis back towards Berlin. They were riding on Sherman tanks that had been a part of the Lend-Lease program. This is the CWC plant here in Muskegon, where a lot of those tank treads were produced. Many of the Sherman tank engines were produced at Continental, and I'd love to know more about the specifics of the tank that he was riding in, but I think there is almost no doubt that a majority of the components that Joe and the Russians fought in, the tank they fought in, had a large part of it made right here in Muskegon. Now, over the next few weeks, Joe and the Russians met fierce resistance. The column was attacked by a German Stuka dive bomber, and he was wounded again. He woke up days later in a Red Army field hospital. Now, as I said in the film, it's estimated that 27 million citizens of the Soviet Union died during the war. Hitler's goal was to eliminate wide regions of Slavic people to provide space for Germany to expand. In preparation for the exhibit, in combination with the Foundation for International Arts and Exhibits and the Lakeshore Museum Center and the Russian State Museum, they went back through their records. Of course, they had suffered a huge amount of damage, but the Russian State Museum suffered or searched through their own archival records trying to find things on Joe Byerly, and they were able to come up and find his medical records of when he was in the hospital. While recuperating in the hospital, Joe was visited by the famous Russian commander Marshal Zhukov. Zhukov wanted to see the American soldier who had been fighting with his troops. He issued Joe with a letter that asked all persons to assist Joe in his return home. So Joe set off with infected wounds and so slowly made his way to Moscow. When he arrived at the American embassy in Moscow, he showed up, knocked on the door, and said, "Hi, I'm Joe Byerly, airborne." And they said, "Well, you're dead. Our records indicate you're dead." And so he was put under semi-arrest and sent to the Metropole Hotel. And I believe that there might be a little more about that story in a little while. It took time to receive his fingerprints from Washington and to prove who he was. Joe was eventually released from the embassy, sent to Odessa, to Istanbul, and then on to Port Said. There he boarded the HMS Samaria, the same ship that had taken him to England years before. And this is more of his medical records that were found. And on April 21st of 1945, Joe Byerly was reunited home with his family. When the War Department had informed Joe's family that he had been killed years earlier, a funeral was held for him. Father Albert Strauss celebrated a high mass for the dead on September the 17th of 1944 at St. Joseph's Church. 2 years later, Joe Byerly would walk down those the aisles of that church when he married his sweetheart, Joanne Hollowell, and started his new life. Joanne worked at the Norton Avenue Myers as a secretary for 20 years. And as I said earlier, she's very well remembered as the head of the Friends of the Frauenthal. Joe and Joanne became the proud parents of 3 children, Julie, Joe Jr., and John, who you're going to meet in just a minute, because I'm going to get through the rest of this quickly. Joe worked at Brunswick for 28 years, and eventually he became a supervisor in the shipping department. Deeply affected by his experiences in the war, Joe became active in a number of community service projects. He was chairman of the local American Red Cross that had sent those packages, those care packages during the war. He worked with the old newsboys. He became a caseworker for the disabled American veterans. And here's the photograph of the children. And here's his veterans items. He was even invited to visit Vietnam as a guest of the 101st Airborne. Now, this is in the post-war years, the baby boomers, of which I and the speakers that are coming up in just a few minutes are all members. And over time, Joe's story would become well known. He told me he didn't talk a lot about it in the 50s, the 60s, and the early 70s, because if you'll think back to those times, that was the height of the Cold War, and it was not a real good time to walk around and tell people, well, you know, I was good friends with the Russians, and I fought with them. But eventually his story came out. In 1994, Joe was invited by President Clinton to a special ceremony in the Rose Garden. It was the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin presented a medal to Joe. He went back to France and Poland to visit, and he was also invited to return to Moscow as a hero, and he was recognized as a comrade veteran of the Great Patriotic War. His wife and his children were all important parts of these visits. Thomas Taylor, who was a veteran of the 101st Airborne, was fascinated by Joe's story. He wrote a book called The Simple Sound of Freedom, and when that was sold out of print, the book was reissued as Behind Hitler's Lines. On December 12th of 2004, while visiting Toccoa, Georgia, where he had trained 62 years earlier, Joe Byerly passed away. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. As I said earlier, following the funeral, Joanne decided that she wanted the archival material in his uniforms to come to the Lakeshore Museum Center. About 2 years after that ceremony, I had a visit from the family. They wanted to know if we still had the artifacts and if they could have them back. And I said, well, we don't normally do that. We don't, when things are entrusted to the care of the museum, they become ours to entrust for the citizens of Muskegon County in perpetuity. I said, why do you ask? And they said, well, do you ever loan them to other museums? And I said, on occasion. We'd be glad to work with another museum on occasion. And I got the message, well, we'll be back to you. And I remember it very, very clearly. I got a phone call, kind of a scratchy phone call, a cell phone where there's not good reception. And it was John, and he said, I couldn't tell you earlier, but if you watch tonight's news, you'll find out that I was just endorsed as ambassador to Russia. And that set up the process that led to an exhibit with the Russian State Museum. This is the Stroganov Palace in St. Petersburg, where the exhibit opened. These are photographs from the opening and the seminar that took place. And I'm going to tell a story before they come up. This is a very powerful photograph for me, and this I also studied a lot of diplomatic history. Here is a man walking into a formal reception in Russia, and he's announced as the ambassador to Russia. Now you can imagine the weight and the dignity that that would carry. And he's standing there and saying, oh, and by the way, that's my dad. Well, my wife and I were in St. Petersburg, a place I don't recommend visiting in February. It's even colder than Muskegon. We wanted to take a quick side trip. I wanted to see the Amber Room and Catherine's Palace, and Susan wanted to pay her respects to the Tsar and his widow. So we traveled out to Pushkin, and while we were going out, it's about 20 miles outside of St. Petersburg, not terribly far, but when we were driving out to this little village and these wonderful mansions, there were regions of just big sections of concrete obelisks in the fields, just kind of random. And I asked our driver, I said, what are those? And he said, those mark the German gun positions during the siege. And I started to get a little tear in my eye. Now, Neil mentioned that I've been here almost 24 years now. And my wife looked at me funny and said, what's going on? And I said, besides the grit and determination of the Russian people, the thing that kept those German guns out here is the gray iron from the foundries of Muskegon, Michigan. I've never forgotten that moment. Here we are at St. Catherine's Palace. This is the exhibit in Nebraska, and we bring it back home. The version of the exhibit that we did for the Lakeshore Museum Center talked a great deal about the family, about Joe's life here in Muskegon, and about Muskegon's role. The exhibit was pretty much laid out on a series of panels. And I'm pleased to announce tonight that those panels from this exhibit are going to be on permanent display down here at the Silversides Museum starting in just a couple of months. Yeah. This is an important story. It's an international story. It's one that's traveled all around the world. And it is a part of the heritage of the community that you and I call home. Thank you.
You know, before we introduce everybody, Julie and Joe will wait for John to get here, but one of the special items that the family has in their possession, and you saw a picture of it, the John's Museum also has one, but they have the Russian submachine gun, exactly for those of you interested in weapons, the same one that their father used. This is not the identical one, but the same model that their father used in the Russian military, the Soviet military. And Joe is going to talk a little bit about that. We have Don Kitchen holding that, but it's unique. And Joe, go ahead.
Okay, it's a PPS H-41, the standard Russian submachine gun that was used in the Second World War. 7.62 millimeter. The drum magazine holds 50 rounds, and it has no safety. It was fully armed all the time. A lot of Russians were killed by their people.
Let me introduce the members of the family then at this point. To your far left is Julie Sugars. Julie is the nicest of the three children.
It's true.
Julie is a graduate of Western Michigan University, a retired English teacher from the Oak Ridge School District.
Go Eagles.
She is here, and we can't mention Julie without her husband because they are such an item together. She's here with her husband, Coach Jack Sugars, championship football coach from Oak Ridge. Jack, just want to wave your hand. Thank you. And Jack and Julie both live here in Muskegon County. In the center is Joe Byerly II, commonly known as Joe II. And like his father, Joe is a veteran of the 101st Airborne Division. He served, I believe, 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Is that right, Joe, or just one long one? Yeah. 2. Okay. And he served there during the Tet Offensive, and he's been an officer for many years of the Michigan 101st Airborne Association. He is currently a member of the Board of Governors of the National 101st Airborne Association and is chairing the committee of the Pratt Memorial in Normandy, General Pratt being an American general who died on D-Day, was he in a glider, Joe?
Glider, yes,
sir. Glider, General Pratt dying in a glider in Normandy. Joe is a retired manufacturing representative and lives in Howell, Michigan with his wife, Kathy. John Byerly is to your far right. John is a graduate of Grand Valley University, and he joined the State Department in 1993. He served in several positions in Central and Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union, and then later Russia. He served as a National Security Council advisor on the National Security Council on Russian and Soviet matters to President Clinton, on Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs. President Bush appointed him as ambassador to Bulgaria. Subsequently, in 2008, President Bush appointed him then as ambassador to Russia, and President Obama reappointed him to that position after taking office. John served as ambassador to Russia through up until 2012, when he retired from the State Department service. John was presented the State Department's Superior Service Award 4 times during his career, an outstanding accomplishment. In case it's interesting, he speaks Russian fluently. He also speaks Bulgarian, Czech, and German. So, and he holds a master's degree.
Neil.
No.
You forgot the most important one.
French too. Okay, thank you. Yeah. We're joking because I try to speak some French. I was a French major.
Good French.
Yeah. So, and he also holds a master's degree from the National War College. So, welcome, all of you. George asked me to prepare some sort of icebreaker questions for the family, and I'm going to do that, but you all also hopefully have an opportunity to ask some questions. And they've seen these in advance, so they aren't being blindsided totally. Julie, as the oldest child, how did you first become aware of your father's World War II experiences, and what was your reaction when you learned about his history?
The answer is really a two-part answer, I guess. As a child, I learned about it. My dad had a dent in his head. Any of you who knew him, it was quite visible in the top of his head. And I remember as a child putting my, I'll be fine in a minute, putting my finger in that and asking what happened. And he said, "Oh, a German got mad at me." And you press your dad for a little more answer. And of course, what does a child, I didn't know what a German was, but none of it made sense. And he said, he asked my name, and I said I was Joe Hambone from Chicago. And he hit me with the butt of his rifle. We didn't have guns in our house. I didn't even know what the butt of a rifle was. So that would be my very earliest memory of asking that. When did I become aware of the story that many of you have read and the bits of it that you have heard today? I learned the full story when I read the first galleys of the book, The Simple Sounds of Freedom. My dad, like so many of that generation and veterans of other wars, didn't talk about it much, or at least didn't talk about it with the daughter, the girl, as I discovered. And so we knew bits and pieces. You saw a picture of us as kids. When I was 11, we were called home from school. The Grand Rapids Press did a story on him, and that's when I learned that they called him a hero. Now, my dad would never liked the word hero. To him, the heroes were the men. I didn't think this would happen. To him, the heroes were the men who didn't come home. And that's what I remember, most about that.
Julie, your mom and dad, they did not meet and get married until after the war. Do you know when your mother first learned about your dad's war experiences? And did she ever discuss them with you? And what about that?
No, we really didn't talk about it. After reading his book, I thought, boy, so many things about my dad make sense now that would have helped make it easier to understand. When we had to clean our plates, it was because he literally had starved. I and Jack had the privilege of traveling with my parents to England to see where he trained, to Starvation Hill to see where he was kept prisoner. At the time, our son was in his 20s, and I just remember thinking, there is no way that our son would have been able to go through this. And I said that to my dad, and my dad said, a man does what he has to do when he has to do it. And I thought, okay. So really I didn't know until I was a grown woman with adult children the breadth of the story.
Thanks, Julie. Good. For Joe, your dad was severely tortured by the Gestapo when he escaped from his POW stalag, including both shoulders being pulled out of their sockets and being hit on the head with rifle butts. And yet he never gave them information or confessed to them what they wanted him to confess to be, a spy, I think. What kept him going? How do you think he did that?
We talked about that. When he left for the Army, his mother said, "You do nothing to cause disrespect to our family." And he felt that if he gave any information or didn't try to escape, he was showing disrespect to the family. He was not a worthy person, so that's why he continued to do what he did.
Joe, you yourself, you're a 101st Airborne Vietnam veteran, and your dad visited you there, visited the division there when he was president of the National Association. I can remember talking to him several times, and he said that the big difference between World War II and the Vietnam War was that in World War II the press was censored, and that in the Vietnam War the media was not censored. Can you discuss your dad's beliefs about the role of the media during wartime?
Well, he was very true. Back in World War II, the media was American media. They were there to report the American side of the war. They were not above issuing false information in their stories to cause the enemy to believe something that wasn't true. Somewhere along the lines, the media has changed, and they do not support the Americans anymore. They're there to report the news as they see it. And whether it's true or not, it's a sad subject for me.
All right, John. You traveled with your dad in Eastern Europe and Russia, retracing his steps there from his escape as a POW to his service in the Soviet Army. Did your dad ever discuss with you the merits between the operations methods of the American Army and the Soviet Army, with the American command structure leaving more discretion to ground commanders and the Soviet command system being more highly centralized?
Well, the thing I remember about my dad's comment or his observations about having fought with the Russians was his surprise. His surprise that the Russians didn't fight at night. And I remember saying to him at one point, well, most armies don't fight at night. My father's experience in training was it was all at night. He jumped into Normandy the night before D-Day. Much of their training was at night because they knew that they were going to be running around in the dark, and they had to get used to that. So he actually ended up fighting longer with the Soviet army than he did with the Americans. He was in combat in Normandy for less than 2 days, I think.
Well, 3 days.
3 days. He fought with the Russians after he made his last escape from the prison camp. We think around between 10 and 15 days. We're not exactly sure of the number. But he didn't really comment too much on the tactics of war. And, of course, at that level, it's very hard to tell how much input the generals are having into what your daily movements are as a soldier. But he very much appreciated the fact that when he was completely defenseless after he escaped from the prison camp, and when Easton linked up with the Russians, that they took him in and actually gave him that weapon that you saw. And that when he was practically starved after hiding out for 2 or 3 days, the first thing they did after they looked at his package of Lucky Strikes and found an interpreter was give him a hot meal. That's something that stayed with my dad for a very, very long time, probably his whole life, and always would color his views of the Soviets and the Russians, even during the worst of the Cold War, when the Russians were our ideological enemies and adversaries. We in our house, and certainly my dad, had a different personal experience with those people because they saved his life.
John, he, in the tank unit, I can recall he often talked about the Mongols fighting in the tank unit. Can you tell the audience about that. We may be in the impression that all the Soviet troops were Soviet.
Well, by the end of World War II, and by the time my dad linked up with the Russians, it was early February 1945. They had already lost somewhere between 7 and 8 million soldiers. They lost many more civilians, but just in terms of soldiers, they were running out of Russians, and they were bringing conscripts from the far parts of the Soviet Union that are on the border with China and Mongolia. And in fact, many of the soldiers that he fought with were from parts of Russia in which the people have Asiatic features. And frankly, they were also running out of men at that point. One of the reasons why the tank commander of the unit that he linked up with was a woman, simply because the number of men who died by that point was catastrophically high.
And that leads to the next question. I think we're all aware that the United States military now, we're going to be permitting women in combat. I think the details are being worked out, but your father's commander in the Russian military, or Soviet military, was a major, a woman. Now, cover your ears if you have tender ears, but her battle cries, I understand it, was when she would take off in the tank into battle, she'd say, "Follow my ass." What was your dad's reaction to have a woman commander?
Like I said, I think he was amazed, and frankly, a lot of Russians to this day are amazed to find out that there were women commanding tank units at the end of the war. But as I said, there's a good logical reason for that. He was just so delighted to be out of the prison camp. He was so happy to be in friendly hands. The Russians were our allies at that point. They were feeding him. They gave him a weapon, and they allowed him to ride along in what he hoped would be a short ride to Berlin where he would link up with the Americans. It turned out to be not quite that easy. But I think that, I don't know really what his view of women serving in the military was. He was a fairly traditional conservative guy, so I think he would have a problem with women serving in combat units in the American Army. But he was certainly very happy to serve under a woman Soviet tank commander, especially one who saved his life.
Dan, let me ask one more, then we'll open up to the audience. This is probably best for you, John. As a former ambassador to Russia and having many years of experience there, can you tell us how deeply embedded World War II remains in the consciousness of the Russian people, and why your dad is so warmly remembered there and respected in Russia?
It's very difficult for Americans to understand how deeply the wartime experience in which the Soviet Union lost between 27 and 29 million people, soldiers, but predominantly civilians, how much that experience has formed the consciousness, not just of the generation that lived through it, but their sons and their granddaughters and even their great-grandsons and great-granddaughters. It was the defining experience for most Soviets and most Russians in the 20th century. And there was a time at which every Russian could say, every person living in the Soviet Union, because remember we're talking about Ukrainians and Armenians and Latvians and Georgians, everyone at some point in the 1960s or 1970s could say they knew someone or had someone in their family who had died in the Second World War. That kind of experience was really formative, and it was used by the Soviet leadership as a kind of way to bring the country together behind a national idea, but that has lived on beyond the demise of the Soviet Union. And to this day, the May 9th holiday, it's the day the Soviet Union, or that the Russians today and the Ukrainians celebrate the victory over Germany, is still one of the biggest holidays in Russia to this day.
Good. Thank you. Well, I've gotten things rolling here a little bit, and John McGarry here. John, would you mind coming up to the chair here just in case you have questions for John, too? So I can keep going, but I don't want to do that. Let's hear it. Any questions you have, and if you can't hear them, I'll repeat them. So, sure, way in the back, sure.
First off, my father worked with your father in Brunswick. They were both veterans, and your father was a very proud member of being a veteran. But more importantly, he was really proud of being 101st. So my question to Joe is, did you have much pressure to join the 101st, or could you have gone to the 82nd?
All right, the question is, Joe, did you have much pressure on you to join the 101st Airborne instead of the 82nd? Joe.
It was always expected I was going into the 101st. I was taken for granted. You have to remember my lullabies were Blood Upon the Risers.
Yeah, John, or Joe, you want to use the microphone? Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Okay, in case you didn't hear it, I was always expected I was going in the 101st. I didn't put that pressure on my son. I've got my youngest boy is now in the National Guard and the military police.
Yeah, okay. Good, sure, sir.
I'd like to comment on the incident of the woman driving the tank. I've read extensively. I don't call myself a historian, but I've done a lot of reading, and I discovered this several years back. The ladies were building the tanks because there wasn't enough men to build them, and when they got one ready to roll and there was no male to command it, guess who got in it and drove it off? The truth. So ladies, that's the truth.
Absolutely.
All right,
Yep,
good.
that's true.
Good. Okay, just, one question might be just to relate. You've looked hard to try to identify that major, haven't you, that woman?
Yeah, there are actually several theories. One main theory of the name of the woman commander, who unfortunately did not survive very long after my dad left her unit. That whole tank unit was wiped out. In fact, the Soviet Army lost about a quarter of their total losses, military losses in the war, in the last 4 months, 5 months before they took Berlin, simply because it was an all-out storm, cannon fodder effort. So really one of the luckiest things that happened to the three of us, so that we could be here with you tonight, is that my dad was wounded and was taken out of that fatal assault that tank unit took part in.
Good. We have some questions back here. Sure. Way in the back.
Does D-Day stand for Devastation Day?
Does D-Day stand for Devastation Day? I don't know why. Joe is really the military historian. Do you know where
John's got it. John's got it.
It's my understanding that because they had to stage things, the airborne guys had to get in a plane so many hours before, and so on, so they needed some specific time frames. The D in D-Day simply stands for day. Just like H hour stands for hour. And so the airborne troops would go in at minus H hour, so many, and the supplies would go in at D+1. It was just a way to mark time. It had no specific meaning.
Good. Thank you. Yeah. Sure. Richard.
Every invasion was called D-Day, but this is the famous one, so everybody thinks that was it. Would the children mention the contribution of their uncles in World War II?
Sure. If you didn't hear that, would you mention the contribution of your uncles in World War II?
Okay, Joe was one of 5 boys. He had 2 older brothers, 2 younger brothers. Both of his older brothers, Bill and John, served. Bill was in the Army Air Corps in England as a grounds crewman working on the bombers. John was a combat engineer in the Pacific Theater on the island hoppings and was severely wounded and discharged. Joe's 2 younger brothers, Richard and Bob, were both too young to have served in the Second World War. Bob, his younger brother, went on to a 25-year-old career in the Navy and his brother, youngest brother, Richard, did a 3-year tour in the Army in Germany for occupation.
Okay. What else? Sure, go ahead.
While you guys were growing up, did your father talk about his stories often, or was that something he kept to himself?
Let me elaborate a little bit on the story that Julie told about feeling that bump in my dad's head, that big dent from the German machine gun or rifle butt. Julie, being very young and being a girl, was too sensitive to really probe him on that. But my brother and I were remembering last night how one night we kind of cornered my dad and said, because he really didn't talk about this, and it was like pulling teeth to get him to say anything about it at all. These were very, very serious things that he'd gone through. He didn't really want to share them with anyone, much less his own kids. But my brother, being very insistent, kept saying, "Dad, what did you say to that German to make him conk you on the head like that? What did you say?" And my dad looked at me and looked at my brother. My sister was in another room, so he said, "I called him a son of a bitch, and I don't ever want to hear you say that word again as long as I live."
Good, great. He's not here. Back, sure.
Sorry, I want to just say one thing before I forget, unless you guys mentioned it. Today, in addition to being St. Patrick's Day, was a very special day in our family. It's our mom's birthday, and she would have been 89 years old tonight. Happy birthday, Mom.
Happy birthday to your mom, and John, dobro utro to you.
Доброе утро.
I can confirm that story. I was one of Joe's fair-haired boys when I worked for him at Brunswick. And Joe, I can remember when he went over to Vietnam to see you, I had just come home in between my training for riverboats for Vietnam, and he said that he was going over to see you, and I said, "Well, when you're there, stop by to see me." But anyway, just to confirm that, he used to tell us of some of these stories as we went to and from Grand Rapids when Brunswick had some ordeals over there going on. And he told us about the plate in his head and how he got that. And that's exactly the terms that he told us that he called that German.
Really? Confirmation. That's an important piece of confirmation.
Yes.
Good. We have time for a couple more. Kurt?
Yes, Julie, as a public school teacher, you certainly touched thousands of students' lives. How did you share this story with your students?
Yeah. Did everyone hear the question? The question is to Julie, as a teacher touching thousands of students' lives. How did you share this story with your students? How did that?
I was a high school English teacher for many years, and this story was actually shared by my colleagues in the history department. And I guess as a child, you hear your father called hero, but you don't really think about what that term means. And he was just my dad with a pretty remarkable story. And my students would listen to my colleagues in the history department tell my dad's story. And my dad visited their classrooms and spoke with their students before he passed away, and indeed with many students across the country, in various parts of the country. And I guess in sharing, it was his deep sense of patriotism, his love for country, his respect for people in general. When my brother used the term son of a bitch, my dad rarely cursed in our house, and we didn't hear much of that language, so to hear that is very interesting. And I guess if I passed anything along to my students, it was his sense of patriotism and love of country and respect for the country, whether you agreed with the president or not, whether you agreed with what was going on, you still respected that office. You respected the efforts that people were making to keep this nation what he had fought to keep it.
And I believe one of his favorite activities was visiting schools. Yes. He loved to visit classrooms and schools. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Got time for one or two more.
Okay. Mine's more current. It's a current issue that's in the news now. Being the ambassador to Russia and being historians,
there are some who have tried to tie in some of the moves that Russia has made in the Ukraine as similar moves to what we saw in the 1940s about Germany coming in. You having this wonderful background with the people in Russia, how do you see this? Well, you know, enlighten us on that. Also.
Well, the question was a current affairs question, looking at the latest Russian moves in Ukraine and in Crimea. Is there some relation between that and what the Germans did to start World War II, which has been cited by some people? I think some of the reasons, frankly, that the Russians have given for what they see as their need to move into Ukraine are as trumped up as some of the reasons that the Nazis gave for moving into Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, at the start or before the Second World War. But I think really the analogy sort of ends at that point, because the Russian aim in going into Crimea, I would argue, is nowhere as vast and demented, frankly, as Hitler's aim in trying to take over all of Europe. That's a short answer to a very complicated issue, but I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Did your father hold any animosity towards the German people?
The question was, did their father hold any animosity toward the German people?
He's got a great story.
I went back with my father to Normandy in 1994 for the 50th anniversary, and we'd been at the American Cemetery in Colville, and we were driving back, and my father was a great one for giving directions. Turn here as you pass the street, you know, that type of thing. So we're going through, and all of a sudden he says to me, "Stop the car." And with my father, when I questioned him, I wouldn't call him Dad, I'd call him Joe. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Stop the car." And I said, "What are you going to do, Joe?" So I stop the car, and we get out, and here's this motel in Normandy, and it's got 6 Fallschläger on the front window. How many of you know what a Fallschläger is? Fallschirmjäger. My German-speaking brother corrects me. It's a German paratrooper. Joe was captured by German paratroopers. And I said, "Oh, God, what now?" It was a reunion. And they're having their reunion in Normandy at the same time. And he got out of the car and put on his 101st hat and his coat. And I said, "What are you going to do, Joe?" And he said, "I want to see, and remember, I want to see if that SOB," because I only ever heard him say the B word once, "if that SOB that captured me is in there." So he goes barging to the door. I'm following him. We walk in, and there's this landing and then a setting area, and there are about 15, 20 60-year-old men sitting around this table and couches. And Joe walks in, stands at the very top of the stairs, and starts looking every guy in the face. And you could just feel the tension building in the room. You know, I'm convinced I'm going to be the last casualty of the Second World War. And we're sitting there, and he looks at the last guy, and he turns to me and says, "He's not here, let's go." That's a long answer to your question.
Okay. I did want to mention, and John alluded to it, is with the cooperation of John and his wonderful museum, that we will be opening here in this museum the Joe Byerly Hero of Two Nations exhibit, target being July 4th weekend. Now, as Frank mentioned, this is a privately supported museum. If any of you are taken by the family story, by Joe's story, please feel free. We'll be recognizing people who donate to the expenses of this of this exhibit. It just isn't putting things up. We want it to be first class and look great. So if any of you have that inclination tonight, where's Frank Marzak? Frank Marzak, Executive Director of the Museum in the back there. Please see him, and we'll be glad to make arrangements for you to help with that effort. That's going to be July 4th weekend, and I see Jim Tyler here from Tyler Sales. And I'm just going to plant this because it really can't be public yet. There's going to be a huge event here in Muskegon County for veterans and military service people on July 4th weekend this year. And please be watching for that. You're going to be blown away. I think I don't mean literally, of course, but but you're going to. Tyler Sales is coordinating this, and with the backing of the Fields of Glory Foundation and Budweiser, and it's going to really be something. And we're going to open that exhibit here that weekend. So thank you so much to John McGarry. Julie, Joe, and John, and we'll all be here after the session. Thank you.